Hi everyone. My mum's up the back and I think she'll be glad that I'm on the news for the right reasons these days. Thanks for the introduction, Karina. You gave most of the details. I work for a native woodland charity based in West Clare. My topic, I'm probably following in a long line of Nuffield scholars who looked into social licence, and mine was about returning trees to the Irish landscape. So a little note on social licence. It's essentially the trust or approval of the community a system or a business operates within. Okay, and for the most part, at least in rural Ireland, I would suggest that farming occupies this area. It gets general approval, maybe less so in urban areas, but I would say forestry, especially in recent years, occupies this area. It's not particularly popular with local communities. Certainly not popular with NGOs, and certainly from a farming point of view, forestry isn't going well, certainly in the last 15 years. So what I wanted to find out in my research was what the barriers to acquiring or re-establishing social licence were, where the opportunities lay, should we re-establish it, and maybe to chart some viable paths forward. So there's me and my crack team of scholars just outside the Houses of Parliament in the UK. Okay, so I just wanted to give a little bit of context about woodlands or forestry in Ireland. As most of you know, Ireland 20,000 years ago was under a sheet of ice a kilometre high. When that ice melted, trees quickly established themselves, and they estimate about 80% of Ireland would have been covered in forest 10,000 years ago. That was down to just 20% 3,000 years ago. Mostly, the two main factors were the discovery of iron and the introduction of agriculture. So the ancestors of a lot of the people in this room would have cleared woodlands to make way for agriculture, primarily pasture-based agriculture. By 1600, we were down to 10%, and around the formation of the state, we had 1%, just 1% left. That's your. So I think this image from Clonaglan Lake in South Kerry typifies where the woodlands remained, the hardest to access places, places that it was just difficult to cultivate. That's where the woods hung on in Ireland. This is a fascinating graph charting the decline of woodlands from 1600 on, and that severe dip at the end is really interesting. It relates to the passing of the Land Act in 1880, and when the large aristocratic estates knew the game was up, they felled a lot of the trees, and those estates, when they passed into the hands of Irish farmers, felled more trees to make way for agriculture. And you can see there's a steady increase since that point. We're at about 12% woodland cover in Ireland today. We followed a very particular model, a model of fast-growing North American conifers managed on a clear fell basis. So grow for 40 years, fell all at one stage. Very understandable. Forestry was conceived as a driver of the rural economy. And native Irish trees have a very long rotation. Even though they're valuable when you harvest them, they have a long rotation period of 100 years plus. So this model certainly worked economically, but there was a lot of mistakes made along the way, particularly in relation to habitat displacement, biodiversity damage, and even to potential carbon sequestration in the long term. So why is it so difficult, this re-establishment of social licence, or bringing trees back to the Irish landscape? I find this is actually just south of where we live in West Clare, and I find it to be a really interesting picture. It's a kind of a model of maybe what some parts of rural Ireland could be, an interesting mix of agriculture. You can see silage making, some wild native woodland, and some productive conifers in the background. Why is this so difficult to re-establish? So this was kind of the subject of my research. Why are we struggling to get to a position like this? So these were the barriers that I found to be significant. I'll start on the right, which are the farmers, and then the left of the public. So farmer outlook and culture, and this isn't my opinion. Farmers have a distinct and negative view of forestry. And again, that's not my opinion. There's multiple papers from UCD that suggest, and it's understandable. Forestry typically in an Irish context has displaced farming. So it's understandable that farmers are a little wary of this idea of trees coming in. Farmer knowledge, not farmer knowledge about trees, which is probably better than the average citizen, but farmer knowledge about tree schemes and options. I work in the area, and I know farmers actually don't know what's Many farmers don't know what's available to them. Scheme suitability and flexibility. So if the farmers do know about a scheme and they look into it, do they find it's flexible enough and suitable enough for their scenario? Usually not. We have one water for woodlands for water scheme in Ireland. New Zealand has 13 different scenarios. And it asks a farmer to give up 30 metres back from the riverbank. I don't know many farmers who want to give up that kind of area. And there's no flexibility in the scheme. So contradictory land use policies. We're asking farmers to put land into long-term woodland establishment or woodland creation, but there's also long-term tax-free leasing available. So it's a contradictory scenario where after 30 years, you don't get your land back from the forestry. It's in permanent native wood or permanent woodland, but with long-term leasing, you do get your land back with no drawbacks. I think there's been a leadership vacuum, both from within the forestry sector and from within the farming sector. There's no champions or advocates of trees. And that, again, is understandable. The way the system has gone in recent years with licensing problems, it's a hard one to recommend with your hand on your heart to if you're a farm advisor or if you're in a farm rep org, it's hard to recommend forestry because the system in many ways has let farmers down. Timber is the only valued output. I think that's a real barrier because a lot of surveys have shown that farmers are quite interested in trees, primarily native trees. But really, a forester that I know, Padraig Dolan, said planting the native woodland scheme is like shackling oneself to penury. You plant the trees, the land is subject to a permanent land use change, and there's no money for 100 years after the premiums have run out. So, if we only value timber, it's no surprise that we'll only get conifers. There are natural threats. It's already a big deal for farmers to put their land into forestry. And then you've got deer, you've got ash dieback, you've got Phytophthora in larch. So there's concern there. And there's trust in the system. Again, when a farmer goes into forestry, it's a long-term contract with the state. And many times they've been let down. The licensing fiasco over recent years has been a good example. But even further back, around 2008, the premiums were cut and the duration that the farmers received a premium for was shortened from 20 years to 5 years. That's been remedied, thankfully. Well, will be from 2023 on. From a public point of view, you've got legacy woodland issues. People see huge areas of uplands or blanket bogs covered in conifers and they think forestry is a disaster, not acknowledging that maybe things have moved on. There's also a lack of information on the part of the general public about what and why, what kind of forestry is done today and why it's done. And obviously there's concerns about biodiversity loss. The hen harrier, the curlew have certainly both suffered from afforestation. So the 2021 scholars came into Nuffield right in the middle of COVID, and certainly it affected the early period of our travel and research and studies. But it was a benefit to me in a lot of ways. I got to see, I travelled a lot and we all travelled a lot inside Ireland, and I got to see every farm system, every farm type, habitat type in the country, and it was hugely important to getting a broad understanding of what the barriers are and where the paths forward or opportunities lie. Thankfully, COVID concluded to some extent, at least in relation to international travel, and we were able to hit the road, and I was lucky enough to go on a great GFP the summer gone by. I learned there was interesting nuggets to be learned from every country I visited. In Japan is a country of 110 million, 4 times the size of Ireland, and it's 70% covered in forest, and that's fascinating. A super developed first world economy with 70% forest. Multiple different reasons. One of them is that they're economically dominant on their neighbours, Indonesia, so they could import their logs from there. But there are other subtler reasons. They've got their national religion is Shinto, and I remember a farmer called Kenji explaining to me that this means they see God in everything, and maybe there's more of a reverence for the natural world than we've been able to hang on to here in Ireland. California taught me a lot about social license, or the problem for farmers or any industry when you lose it. I was with Brendan on this trip, we visited a dam, the San Luis Dam. It was built specifically to provide water for agriculture. But last year, its allocation to farmers in the region was 0 because they hadn't been able to tell their story well enough, so the water was distributed to environmental reasons or to urban setups. In Ethiopia, a country where the average person produces 88 times less carbon than the average Irish person. They've embarked on a huge, really ambitious tree planting program that would really put anything we're doing here in Ireland to shame. And I thought, God, if a country like Ethiopia, so disadvantaged, can do it, why are we struggling here? Maybe context that's closer to home, Scotland were having serious difficulties with their afforestation project, and they managed, mostly through good communication with landowners, to go from 4,000 hectares a year to 13,000 hectares a year in just a couple of years. So where are the opportunities? For me, a huge one is farmer well-being. It might seem like an odd place to start, but there's a real paradox. Farmers are not currently choosing forestry, but all the farms I visited that had planted forestry, they were really attached and really connected and felt proud of it. So I think there's a real benefit to farmer well-being. There's system benefits to farms in terms of forage, stock management, riparian protection. There's regulatory compliance. It probably relates back to the last one. Water quality is such a big issue, and there is a role for trees in protecting water quality. Obviously, with the new premium, income diversification is a massive benefit and will be going forward. I really think trees have a role to play in the perception of farming, how farming is perceived by the general public. And finally, I've really come to believe a lot of farmers are really concerned by their legacy, and so many farmers I spoke to were really happy and proud of what had been left to them by their ancestors, and I think it could be a real motivator for today's farmers to leave amazing woodlands and trees to their children. So I was lucky enough to be able to implement some of my learnings from Nuffield while still doing the research. I conceived of with two colleagues of mine the Island Farm Forest EIP, which was a trial to find out, are there mechanisms which will allow us get farmers on board with woodland creation. This is my second last slide, so I'll be concluding soon enough. And what the Island Farm Forest program allowed farmers is flexibility, information, time to decide, and good incentives. So we worked with 12 farmers in 4 townlands near Milltown Malbay. Each one of them got a visit from myself, the forester, and the ecologist. We drew up a list of options like this for them, small-scale plantings and large-scale plantings. And 10 out of 12 of the farmers did a licensed native woodland of average 5 hectares, and all of them did a small native woodland, average 3,000 trees. So there is something in that. There's a path forward for Irish forestry in that. So overall, my recommendations: we need creation of a well-resourced forestry agency with executive function. Okay, that's something to deal with licensing, communication, promotion, standards, and the challenges faced by the industry. Secondly, we need the state to underwrite a framework for natural capital. At the moment, it's really hard. It's, as I said, the only value in woodland creation is timber. Okay, if we allow our farmers to get value out of carbon, out of biodiversity, out of water quality, we can really set woodland creation free. Okay? Ensure a supportive policy infrastructure. I talked about that already. Embrace nature-based solutions. We're not the sole arbiter of woodland creation. Trees have been planting themselves for millions of years if we facilitate that opportunity through reduction in herbivore numbers, wild deer and sheep primarily in the west of Ireland. Finally, rebuilding a broad woodland culture through education and effective communication. I really think that cuts both ways. We need farmers to be aware of what opportunities are there for them, but we also need the ENGOs to be realistic about what to expect from farmers. Recently, we've been hearing calls to ban coniferous forestry. That's really silly. Yes, we need to get the balance right, but certainly we can't build a timber industry out of just indigenous Irish trees. So I just added this slide at the very last minute because something Jeff said really resonated with me, and that's that we need to be careful about acting with yesterday's logic. So this is looking south from towards Lineen in County Galway, and it's obviously a sheep-grazed upland hill. And yesterday's logic was, well, sheep will survive up there and there's some meat can be produced. But there's so much potential on that hill for carbon, for woodlands, for biodiversity. So, thanks so much for listening, and looking forward to chatting later on. Sorry if I...